Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Beginner's Guide to Groove Agent 5. Let's face it, Groove Agent 5 isn't the most friendly of plugins to beginners. I mean, just look at it. It's a very intimidating interface, lots and lots of features, and quite frankly, it's not very intuitive. There is a steep learning curve to this thing. What I'm going to do today, though, is give you a really basic, easy introduction to the thing so that we can get up and running with patterns, grooves in Groove Agent as quickly as possible. We want to be able to do some minimal editing on these things and have a basic understanding of how Groove Agent interacts with Cubase. I hope you enjoyed this video today, and if you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. Okay, let's get underway. Here we have an initialized Groove Agent. We've got no kit loaded at the moment. This thing isn't going to make any sound. Let's have a very brief introduction to the plugin itself before we actually start making sound. Groove Agent's capable of hosting 4 independent drum kits simultaneously. They're called agents, and we have these 4 slots across the top that represent these 4 holding areas. We're only going to load 1 kit today, and in fact that's my default methodology. I don't typically load more than 1 kit into any instance of Groove Agent at any one time. The kits that we do load into these agents come in one of 3 different flavors, and the flavor of the kit that you load into this agent slot is going to fundamentally change how Groove Agent behaves. Groove Agent really is 3 different drum machines in one, and it tries to make it look like it's only one, sometimes to its own detriment, and that's something that we need to be careful of today. The first thing that we're going to do today is to load one of those agent types. I'm going to load a beat agent kit into this agent slot. I'm going to say load kit with patterns, and we've immediately hit another decision point. Do we want to load just a drum kit, or do we also want to load some MIDI patterns along with that drum kit? You don't necessarily have to load both at the same time. Now, I just said load kit with patterns, so I obviously am going to. The drop-down box at the top allows me to select which content set. So these are basically like expansion packs, and Groove Agent itself comes bundled with several expansion packs. The ones I'm going to talk about today are SE expansion packs, so they're going to be available to everybody. And we're going to start by loading a beat agent preset. So here's my SE kits content set, and I'm going to choose the top item in the list, Ambience Kit 01. I'm simply going to double click on that entry. So I've just now loaded not only a drum kit, but also some MIDI patterns into Groove Agent, and we are now good to go. Just before I press play, a quick description of what a beat agent is. It's a sample player. So beat agent drum kits are fundamentally based on samples, and you're going to see that today. The other kind of kit that we'll have a look at a little bit later is acoustic agent drum kits, and they're modeled on real world drum kits that you would expect a human being to sit down and play. There is a third kind called percussion agent. We're not really going to worry about that today. It's a very close relationship to the acoustic agent kits. All of that's for later. Let's press play and have a listen to what this thing sounds like right out of the box. So everything that you're hearing there is samples. You can't see those samples at the moment. You can see that I press play inside Groove Agent. It has its own little mini player. Groove Agent actually mirrors a lot of the functionality that you'll see in Cubase. And as you'll see today, you can do a lot of the work in Groove Agent, or you can export your patterns into Cubase and do a lot of the work over there. It's really a matter of personal choice which one you choose. So what are we looking at here? Well, on the left-hand side of the interface, you're going to see one of 2 things. You're going to either see a collection of MIDI patterns, if you have the pattern button selected. They're collected together in groups of 16 pads, and here you can see the 16 pads that have been populated for this particular preset. Each agent has 8 different pattern groups, so 8 times 16 is 128 potential MIDI patterns for each individual agent, for each individual kit. What you heard when I pressed play then was the pad that's been loaded onto G# -1. If I click that pad with my mouse, that's another way to hear the rhythm. If I choose a different pattern pad instead, I choose A-1, now you're going to hear a different groove. And each time I press play in the interface, the pattern that's currently selected is the one that's going to get played. When the pattern button is selected in this left-hand panel, the central panel reflects information to do with that MIDI pattern. So what we're currently looking at in this central panel is some information about the MIDI pattern that's currently being played. Here, for instance, is the name of the MIDI groove itself that you're listening to. When you first load Groove Agent, you might not even be able to see this right-hand panel. This is the browser, and I have this thing open all the time. It's actually accessed from this little button here that says Show or Hide Load Panel. As you can see, I've got it turned on, and I am never without that. I basically never use Groove Agent in this mode. So we're going to ignore that for the time being. We'll have a bit of a play with it later. Let's look at this middle panel. So everything that we're seeing here is to do with the pattern. This central panel can be absolutely bewildering to the beginner. I think the easiest thing to do for today's purposes is say, don't go past the edit button as far as these upper options are concerned. The other stuff it's all very interesting, very useful, but not for today. I have done a much larger series where I've described all of the components in Groove Agent 5. I'll put a link to that so that you can really dive in when you're ready. But today we're just sticking with the edit button. The two interesting sub-options are Agent and Pattern. Agent allows us to see essentially a MIDI player that's going to represent this MIDI pattern as it plays. You can see little lines strobing across. When we jump over to the Pattern tab, we actually get to see that rhythm in all its glory. Each time I select a new pad on the left-hand side, the pattern's going to be updated to reflect that newly selected pattern. If I press play again, you can see that pattern playing. Back over in the left panel, the other primary view that we can have of Groove Agent is the instrument view. So when I click the instrument button, now all of the pad information changes. We're no longer looking at MIDI patterns, now we're looking at individual drum sounds. There's the kick, here's a snare, shaker, toms. Each time I select one of those pads, the central panel updates to reflect information about that currently selected pad. So when we're in pattern view, you're looking at MIDI pattern information, and in instrument view, you're looking at, in this case, sample information. Here's the actual waveform of this hi-hat, this open hi-hat that you're listening to. Again, with the bewildering number of options, look at all of these tabs across here. You basically don't need to worry about any of that for today's purposes. Just make sure that you've always got the edit button selected at the top, and down below we don't need to go past the main tab. All of these other tabs just give you more and more information about what's going on under the hood. So take a minute or two to toggle between these pattern and instrument views and get used to looking at Groove Agent in these two different contexts. Is it a MIDI player, a pattern player, or is it an individual sample player? It does both at the same time. I'm going to head back up into the Beat Agent and right click on this image at the top. Now I'm going to load a new drum kit along with all of its MIDI patterns. So once again, I'm going to select the With Patterns option and I'll double click Chill Out Kit. Sometimes when you load a new kit, Groove Agent will actually just fire up and start playing in its own internal player. Just press stop if that happens. I find it really annoying when it does. Okay, so we've just loaded this Chill Out Kit. Let's have a listen to one of these grooves. Now let's say I like that groove, but there's an annoying kind of noise sound on every fourth beat that I don't want to hear. I can quite easily visually identify which noise it is. It's this G-sharp 1 sound. So let's get rid of that sound. I'm going to leave the rest of the pattern intact, but I don't want these G-sharp 1 notes. With my drumstick tool selected, I can simply click on each of these notes and make them go away. I've just edited that pattern. Let's say I'm now happy with it. I want to export that pattern into Cubase. Well, the export option lives in the primary agent view. Don't forget, everything that we're doing here is editing the MIDI pattern. But in order to do my export operation, I need to jump back to the agent page. And the export option is this drag MIDI pattern to host sequencer. All I need to do is pick up and drag and then drop it onto my instance of Groove Agent. You can see it's telling me where it's going to drop it. And there it is, done. And you can see that this is a 2-bar pattern that's represented in the viewer. Let's make my cycle 2 bars long. So this time I'm not going to press play inside Groove Agent. I'm going to press play inside Cubase instead. Exactly the same rhythm. And this is where you'll need to make your own personal choices as to where you're going to do the majority of your editing. Do you want to do your editing inside the Groove Agent pattern and keep everything in there? Or do you want to export it into Cubase and do the majority of your editing there instead? Close Groove Agent down for a moment and just presume that you want to move it over into Cubase. I'll double click so that we can see all of the notes. Now at the moment we're seeing that MIDI information represented as if it was notes played on a keyboard. Obviously this is a drum rhythm, so we want to turn this into drum rhythm oriented MIDI data. That's really easy to do. In the inspector on the left hand side, I select my primary instrument, my Groove Agent instrument. See this option down below that says no drum map. Drop that down and I can say create drum map from instrument. Now when I execute that operation, we don't immediately switch to the drum editor. I kind of think you should, but Cubase doesn't. What you need to do is basically click out of the MIDI part and then click back in, and Cubase will kind of spring into life. So now you can see a much more intuitive, this is much easier to understand from a rhythm perspective. You see all of the notes properly represented and they've all been correctly labeled. The integration between Groove Agent and Cubase is very tight. You can also see that we've only got 7 tracks of information here. Groove Agent contained more instrument data than that. If we have a look back at it on the instrument view, so that we're looking at all of the individual samples inside this drum kit, there's 16 populated pads here, each with their own sounds. When we look at it in Cubase, we only see the ones that have note information. That's a visibility option inside Cubase. This visibility agent is currently set to show drum sounds with events. If I set it to in use by instrument, then you can see basically everything that's populated inside Groove Agent. This is obviously a very clean view, so we'll stick with that for now. Okay, so we've got our first 2 bars of rhythm set up, and they've been exported to Cubase, and I'm happy with that. I now go back to my pattern viewer to choose a new groove. Let's have a listen to groove number 8. So it's got that annoying noise sound again. Let's get rid of that. Jump over to the pattern tab and get rid of all of my G-sharp 1s. There they all are. But this time there's a drop of the kick in the second bar. So the kick is absent and that gives the rhythm a different feeling. Let's do some editing of this pattern. Let's say I want to add a snare. So I'll get it running inside the Groove Agent player. And I want to add some of these snares. Let's do them on an off beat. I'm going to do a 16th note offset just before beats 2 and 4. And we'll see how that sounds. Don't want all 4. And okay, so there's my snare, a very simple snare rhythm added. So now the kick's dropping, but the snare's increasing in complexity. Happy with that. I'm going to export that into Cubase. Jump back over to my agent view so that I've got access to my export function. And now when I drag this pattern into Cubase, whatever MIDI pattern happens to exist at this moment in time, that's what's going to get exported. So if we select this MIDI pattern and have a look at it, there you can see we now have a new entry. We've got 8 instrument pieces in total, and here's snare 2. Now at the moment, these 2 MIDI parts are named after the pattern that was exported. Here's groove 7, here's groove 8. I'm going to glue them together and make one composite 4-bar pattern. And now when we look at that in the drum editor, you can see the snare coming in bars 3 and 4. Let's press play in Cubase and listen to that whole rhythm over here. Let's say I want to add that snare into bars 1 and 2 as well. Well, I'll do that editing from the Cubase side. You see, it's completely seamless and irrelevant which side that you do the editing from. And can you also see that when I added those notes, they're not actually at the same velocity as the old notes? Throw them away. I'm going to make my insert velocity, whatever this happens to be, it's 100. So So if I set my insert velocity to 100, now these will all be added at the correct volume. And the whole thing. Good stuff. Let's say I don't like that snare sound. Let's go back into Groove Agent again. Now I'm going to change that snare sound for something else. In order to edit any individual instrument piece inside the kit, we need to switch to Instrument View. And it's the E1 snare that I want to edit. This is where the beauty of having your browser open permanently comes into its own. Whenever you want it, it's just there. And I can now audition new snare sounds to add onto this pad. We can do that from the Instruments tab of the browser. Just make sure you can see it. Yes, you can. You can set up different selection criteria, and as you can see, my primary method of choice for instrument sets is subcategory, which is in the musical section. There is subcategory, and that allows me to scroll down and select snare drum. And now I can only see available snare drums each time I click in this lower window. If I have pre-listen in place selected, which is this little button, every time I single click on one of these sounds, I'm going to hear it instantly. And it's even going to basically kind of temporarily put this sound onto the pad. If I select snare 2, just watch what happens with this instrument pad. Now it says snare 2, but this sound hasn't been permanently thrown onto that pad. It's a very temporary thing. It's a pre-listen. So it allows me to audition sounds as if they've been loaded onto that pad. I'm going to have to double click the sound if I want to permanently put it there. But what I'm now going to do is get the groove running in the background, and I'm going to be able to select new snare sounds with this pad selected, and it's going to temporarily overlay that snare into the groove. Okay, that's a really nice kind of spacey effect. So let's say I'm happy with that, the Alien Alias cross stick. I'm going to load that permanently onto the E1 tab. It's not happened yet, as I say. If I come out of E1, I select a different pad, we're now going to revert back to our original sound. But I do want to load cross stick, so I simply select E1, double click, and now that really has been loaded on. Now I can play that rhythm in Cubase. And that's my rhythm built. We're going to go on to have a look at Acoustic Agent kits next. So everything that we've been looking at so far has been in the context of a beat agent, which is fundamentally sample based. Just before we do, I'm going to give you one very tiny glimpse under the hood. When we listen to this sound, can you hear that delay bounce that's going on? That's in one of the options that I basically told you to ignore. In the amplifier section for this individual sample pad, we have some auxiliary sends. You can see auxiliaries 1 and 2. This is a reverb, and auxiliary 2 is the delay. If I pull down this send, the delay goes away. So just a very small example of the power of Groove Agent. It's a very fully featured kind of music workstation with tons of really interesting stuff going on under the hood. I'm not going to worry about it any more than that today. Let's load an Acoustic Agent into Groove Agent instead. I'm going to right click, load kit with patterns, and this time I'm going to select one that looks like a drum kit. You can kind of really visually easily see which ones are the drum kits we want to load. I'm going to load another SE kit, the SE Studio kit, and the preset that I've selected for today is Forget the Past. Acoustic Agent kits take a little bit longer to load than Beat Agent kits because we're now playing big samples. You know, this is a real drum kit that's been sampled. Generally speaking, the audio files are much bigger. The load, the stress on Groove Agents is bigger when you're using Acoustic Agent kits because now we have a real drum kit. And the idea with Acoustic Agent kits is that they're designed to sound like they've been played by a human being. Starting from the left-hand panel perspective, things look very familiar. When we have a look in our pattern, here are our 16 pattern pads. They've got kind of similar namings to what we were dealing with in the Beat Agent. Here's some of our main grooves. Like I say, sounds like it's being played by a human being. When we go over to the Instrument tab, again, you can see individual kit pieces that are fairly recognisable. Toms and hi-hats and claps, kick, snare, all makes kind of sense. Back in the pattern view, however, the central panel looks very different. Now we don't get that MIDI player that we had with the Beat Agent, and in fact, we have no option. There's no MIDI pattern to view here either. What you're looking at is a Groove Agent style. Now, a Groove Agent style is essentially a bunch of MIDI patterns all collected together and hidden kind of in a package called a style that allows you a greater degree of kind of flexibility to behave as a human being would. This style is capable of doing things like autofills. So if I engage autofill and make it add a fill to this rhythm every 2 bars, now when I press play, you're going to hear a drum fill every second bar. And the fill that it selects is going to be one of 8 different random fills. So it's a much more dynamic, much more complex arrangement than the simple MIDI player, the pattern player that we had when we were just dealing with simple samples and simple MIDI grooves. There's nothing simple about a style. Well, actually there is. All of that stuff, all of that complexity is great, and you have everything wrapped up in this very nice style player. I've done a full series on the Acoustic Agent. I'll put a link to that below. But really, fundamentally, it all comes down to MIDI patterns. It always does. What you're actually looking at here is, let me just have a look, 16 different MIDI patterns. They're called complexities. It just so happens that for this particular pattern pad that I randomly selected, it's playing complexity number 5. If I select the pad next to it called main 8, you're going to see this complexity number jump to 8. There we go. Here's main 11. I'm just holding the mouse button down here as I'm clicking each of these pads. Did you also see that when I moved away from main 5, the autofill option changed? So all of these different pads have different configuration options. If I go back to main 5, here's the autofill that I engaged on that single pad. So every pad has its own configuration options. And so what you're seeing behind the scenes really is 16 basic grooves, 8 fills, 4 intros, 4 endings, all wrapped up in this very pretty style player. Now it's beyond the conversation today to figure out how the style player works, but suffice to say it all boils down to MIDI at the end of the day. So let's turn my autofill off. Let's get rid of this MIDI pattern that we had from earlier. And now I'm going to pick up this groove using exactly the same function that we had earlier. Drag MIDI pattern to host sequencer. Let's do that. Here's our 4-bar pattern. Can you see all of these kind of little lines in the background? That's articulation information. Let's have a look at the MIDI behind the scenes. You see we've got foot controller. This is basically controlling the hi-hat, the opening and closing of the hi-hat. So even though it's wrapped up in that fancy style player, fundamentally, at the end of the day, it just boils down to MIDI. We've got access to this MIDI information in exactly the same way that we did earlier. I'm going to throw this MIDI information away, load Groove Agent back up again, re-engage autofill, and drag that MIDI pattern out again. And this time, it's going to contain those fills. Let's have a look at it. So what does this sound like? There's a fill. So whatever options you happen to have in the style player at any given moment, when you drag that into Cubase, that's what you're going to get. From that point onwards, this MIDI information is kind of divorced from the style player. You've got complete access to do whatever you want with it. You can see I'm just randomly throwing stuff away here. But we started with this concept of the style. We dragged it into Cubase. We turned it into MIDI data. From that point onwards, everything is very straightforward. Probably the biggest difference between Acoustic Agent kits and Beat Agent kits is that you can't edit individual samples of an Acoustic Agent kit. So if we jump over to the instrument view, you can see everything looks kind of similar. Got a different view now. It looks much prettier than the instrument editor did for beat agents, but we can't actually edit these samples at all. They're locked to this kit. And in fact, all of the articulations for the kit are locked as well. So if I'm dealing with hi-hats, for instance, each of these different sounds is playing on the hi-hat instrument. It is just about there, very tiny hi-hat tip in the background. But I can't change those samples. I can't go into my instrument viewer. It looks like I can, but I can't. If I select hi-hats from this pick list and choose a new hi-hat, I can't just drag that onto that. Looks like it worked, but it didn't. These Acoustic Agent kits are locked, so just bear that in mind. Final thing I'll do today is drag a MIDI pattern from Cubase back into Groove Agent. Head over to my pattern tab, so I'm now looking in the context of patterns or MIDI patterns. I'm going to select an empty group, so none of these pads have been assigned. Pick up my MIDI part, drag it onto a pattern, and now this Groove Agent groove with all of those random changes, you know, when I was talking to you and I was just basically kind of deleting stuff as I was going, all of that MIDI information has just been baked into this pad. Cubase knows that that is simple MIDI information. The pattern tab has miraculously just reappeared. When I click the pattern button, here is the MIDI information, all basically completely available to me. So Cubase has this kind of intrinsic understanding of which pads are styles and which pads are MIDI patterns. You can't have both at the same time, but you can convert styles into MIDI patterns. I'll do it with main 3. There's a little arrow here that says convert style into MIDI pattern. Press that button. And now this pad has just been turned into a MIDI pattern. And there it is. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Helps me out with the YouTube stuff. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.